The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Continuing the pattern of obfuscation, of kicking out a CNN reporter from an event at the White House, instances of publishing transcripts with parts missing, of framing the media as the enemy of the American people, the Trump administration is now going to forego publishing summaries of calls with foreign leaders and instead issue just a couple lines of the very general topics that were discussed. And for anyone who will defend this as saying, of course the Trump administration shouldn't be publishing these readouts of Trump's calls with foreign leaders, those calls are often filled with classified information. These are non-classified summaries. They've always been unclassified summaries. They're part of administration protocol. Republican administrations, Democratic administrations for a very long time have been releasing these. And this is a growing part of the creeping authoritarianism, which we're now learning of as a result of the BBC's reporting. No more public summaries, or readouts as they are called, of the phone calls Donald Trump has with foreign leaders. And they are going to, at their discretion, on their own timeline, choose a few key details to release. So first and foremost, this is mostly symbolic. Like either way, whether it's a readout or a couple of points, either way, the White House is choosing which details are included and which details are excluded, right? The White House writes the readout. We aren't there for the calls either way. So it's once again a move against the appearance of transparency and even against the expectation of transparency of the Trump administration, which, remember, supposedly they were going to be transparent. It was going to be a top transparent organization, not like other organizations. We were going to know what they were doing, and it would all be swamp draining and great for the American people. The readouts have already been a problem for the Trump White House, because you will have a situation where the Trump White House will publish a readout from a call with a foreign leader, and then the foreign leader's office will publish a readout of the same call, and they will directly contradict each other or conflict. So here's one example. There was a call between the Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and Trump. The Pakistani officials put out a readout which said that during the call, Trump was effusively praising Pakistan and the President Sharif. In the U.S. account, there was nothing about the praise that Trump gave President Sharif. And of course, right away, the question was, well, what exactly was he praising him for? Why is the praise not included? And immediately it becomes a problem for the Trump White House that they now have to explain away. But what the real problem here is not the reduced readouts of the calls. It's that Trump has reportedly been giving foreign leaders his personal cell phone number and is having phone calls completely off the record altogether. So the debate over readout versus releasing a few key details sort of becomes a less relevant debate when you find out that Trump is giving world leaders his personal cell phone number and some of these phone calls are happening completely off the record. It's another little push in the direction of not knowing what's being said, not knowing what's going on, the White House opting to provide less information rather than more at any opportunity to do that. And don't forget that at a recent rally, Trump said to the crowd, what you are seeing and what you are reading is not what's happening. It's part of this concerted effort, this small step-by-step move away from democracy and towards autocracy. And imagine just for a second if it was reported that the Obama White House was going to stop publishing readouts of calls, and instead they would just put together a bullet point or two about what Obama discussed with this world leader or with that world leader. The right-wing media apparatus would be going completely crazy. And that's why you have to see this as part of a broader move away from democracy. White House visitor logs. Who's visiting the White House? Gone pretty early on in the Trump administration. Readouts of calls with foreign leaders. Gone. 2-hour Putin meeting with Trump with nobody present. Almost no press conferences. Multiple days a week, cloistered at his own golf clubs. No tax returns released. Close family members are senior advisors. And this is why it's really important to understand that it's a slow creep, okay? We had the story about Kushner and Ivanka work for Trump. We don't often think about that now when we see Trump say the media is the enemy of the American people. And that's why it's important to sort of keep track and to step back and say, wow, there's a lot of authoritarian stuff going on. The family works for him. He's reducing communication and transparency about what he's doing. He's blocking individual media outlets. He's talking about journalism licenses, so on, so on, so on. And I get why Trump would want to do this, right? They're constantly having to walk things back. They're constantly getting caught lying. They stop and they have to explain, well, this is what we meant or this is what we actually said. And the only path forward is to vote in November. And the people that voted for Trump, who maybe cared that Trump promised transparency, doesn't seem like they do because the approval rating is holding pretty steady. This is a combination of George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Some elements more like one, some elements more like the other. It is no longer an exaggeration. It is no longer a hyperbolic analogy. It's very common that people will say, this is just like Orwell's 1984, when it's really not. It is very common that people will say, this is like what Aldous Huxley described in Brave New World, when it's not actually like that. This is like that. This is like that. And the only solution at this point is to vote in November. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We have a fantastic bonus show for you today. We will talk about YouTube removing some InfoWars videos and suspending an alt-right channel from live broadcasts. New Zealand says to Australia, stop copying our flag. Argentina has actually dealt with issues like that, interestingly enough. And failed Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore is now filing a defamation lawsuit over some ads that are running. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. We've got a fantastic program coming up. We will take your calls. We have a great classic interview, and I will also answer some of your questions upcoming. Stay with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is William Purcell. William, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. We do depend on the support of members like William and also of members who have been with us for a really long time, like Alfred Perkins II. Alfred Perkins II, I remember years ago when Alfred Perkins II was new member of the day. And the reason I remember is there was a whole conversation over what's the difference between junior and the second.
Yeah, was he Alfred Perkins Jr. at that time?
He was not. He's been Alfred Perkins II the entire time, and now he's been with us almost 6 years. William, Alfred, thank you. Join them as members at www.joinpakman.com. There is a coupon code available. You don't have to use it, but I say, hey, if you want 40%, take 40% off by using the coupon code VOTESOON18. All right, let's go to our first caller today at 617-830-4750. We're going to go to the 646 area code. Listen for your area code, 646. Go ahead.
Hi, David. My name is Dominique, and I'm a French girl from New York City living in Oklahoma.
All right.
And one day I will call you back and tell you how brainwashed the people here in Oklahoma are.
Okay.
But today I want to talk to you about something you said about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yep.
I agree with you in your assessment of her, but I do feel that what you're missing or maybe not taking into account is modern democratic socialism is a little different from strict democratic socialism. Do you remember there was not a party, but a group called the Social Democrats of America?
Yes.
Well, that no longer exists. If you look it up online, you can't find that organization anymore. Part of the reason they don't exist is because the Democratic Socialists of America now have some capitalist ideas within their platform. And the capitalist ideas they have are the ones that you talk about mixed in with social democracy and with democratic socialism. For example, I believe the post office should be socialized. 50% of the income goes to the workers. And I think in some things, actually, it would work, David. So I would like your feedback and thinking,
Yeah, so
not
let's
taking
take it,
away.
Dominique, if I can take it piece by piece. So first and foremost.
Okay, let's do that. Okay,
So in my analysis where I said there's a lot of confusion here between democratic socialism and social democracy, to be super clear, number one, I said that there are some who would argue that the definitions of these things have merely changed, but then are definitions worth anything anyway, right? So by what we are understanding to be the difference between social democracy and democratic socialism, I had not heard Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually espouse democratic socialist beliefs, and that was sort of an open question at the time. Now, we can say, well,
and I agree with
what
you.
It means has shifted. Okay, well, then I guess we need to redefine some terms, right?
Exactly.
Okay, good. Now, as far as you saying you think that it might not be a bad idea to socialize the post office, in my analysis, and which I did, I think it was like 2 days after the story about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I made clear that while I am not a socialist or a democratic socialist, but I'm a social democrat, I said that I actually do think that the idea of socializing at the individual organization level isn't a bad idea, and it's absolutely something that I'm supportive of individual businesses making as a decision for themselves. The difference was I didn't say what I'm not in favor of is that being a top-down dictate as to how businesses must be organized.
Right. You can't take away private businesses and then socialize them, and then basically, then you could say steal their money. It's kind of not fair. If the company belongs to somebody, you can't just take it away from them and make it a public company. So,
that's my belief, although socialists would disagree. Socialists would disagree with me.
Right. Strict socialists would. But remember, the democratic socialists today don't believe in doing that. What they believe in is democratic socialism mixed in with social democracy.
Okay, well then I guess they're not really socialists per se in that case. Dominique, where in New York are you from?
They are and they aren't. It's a combination, but they identify as socialists because I think the idea is money should not be more important than people. So basically, you have to prioritize making sure everybody's taken care of and nobody's being robbed. You get what I'm saying?
I do, and I think there's many social democrats who would sort of have the same view. Dominique, I've got to go. I just wanted to know, where in New York City are you from?
Well, I'm actually from Manhattan, and I'm French, and I grew up in Paris and New York City. But I now live in Oklahoma. I will call you back, and you will. I don't think you'll be shocked, but the brainwashing in Oklahoma is a scandal.
I don't think I will be shocked. You're right about that. I really appreciate the call. Thank you so much. Great to hear from Dominique from New York City, but now in Oklahoma. Let's go to our next caller. Why don't we go to the 818 area code? Caller from 818, tell us who you are and what's on your mind today.
Hey, David. This is Chris from Los Angeles. And I had a quick question. Do you think we're headed for a recession? And the reason why I ask this is there's a couple factors that I'm thinking about. There's rising interest rates by the Fed. We just came out today that the home sales declined 12% over last year. Auto loan defaults are up. And there's also an inverted yield curve, which predicts a recession. So what are your thoughts about the upcoming year, and is the economy going to get better with the tariffs? There's a lot of factors going into there.
Okay, so I'll answer the last part first. The economy is not going to get better because of the tariffs, number one. But here's the thing. Yes, there is another recession coming. Now, why do I say that? I say that because in history, there has always been another recession coming. I don't pretend to know when it is. I don't pretend to know when it's going to be here. I think that we are really, really bad at predicting these things. When President Obama was running for his second term, and Mitt Romney was making all sorts of promises about the economy, and President Obama was making all sorts of promises, it was pretty clear that not necessarily the next 4 years, but like the next 3 to 6 years, were probably going to be pretty good economically, barring some kind of acute catastrophe. And they were. And I think that the economy would have also been pretty good if Mitt Romney had become president of the United States, although there might have been somewhat of a delta, right? It might have been slightly better or slightly worse, but the trajectory would have been similar. Likewise, so far in the Trump presidency, it's not shocking that we've had the stock market run up that we've had. However,
correct.
Eventually we are going to have a recession. Which indicators do I look at? I don't look at any particular indicator. I think that there's no real way to know exactly when it's coming. I do think that the fact that wages and purchasing power have been stagnant in the United States, even though cost of living has been going up. And at some point, that is going to become a problem. I look at like macro indicators like massive inequality. When we continue to see more and more departure from the very rich and the very poor, at some point, that's going to implode. When it's going to happen, I don't know.
All right, great. Thanks for your insight, and I appreciate your show. I'm a member.
Thank you.
Signed up. I got the 50% off.
Nice.
So I signed up right away, and I'm glad to know you, and thank you for having me on. All
right, Chris, appreciate it. And that was not a staged call, by the way, because he's a member or anything like that. That's a totally real phone call. And why would I even mention that it wouldn't be real anyway? Is that me being paranoid? I don't know. 216 area code. New caller, new topic. 216, go ahead.
Hey, David, thanks for taking the call. I'd like to maybe lay out a problem and just get your question, or lay it out and get your thoughts on it.
Sure.
I think representation is kind of a big one that I just don't hear spoken about enough, and so maybe let me lay it out here real quick. We have the electoral colleges, which is kind of this check on the states and kind of our executive branch to elect the president, but the biggest check on the president is the House of Representatives, which is, again, a state appointed or district body.
Yep.
But the problem for me is the lack of representation in the House. I think we're third worst in the developed world behind China and India in terms of proportional representation, and the lack of voting district, gerrymandering and things like that. So it kind of hurts. Like, you can't really have a functional democracy without proper representation, and two, how you get your representatives. So, the first past the post, and then, changing to like a sort of a state proportional representation. We just don't have enough groups that are. Why don't we have a libertarian wing of the Republican Party? Because there's not enough representatives and how they're voted on.
Okay, let me see if we can slow this down just a little bit and see if I know what you're saying. When you say that we have poor representation in the House of Representatives, do you mean that the number of people represented by each elected official is too high, being 700,000 or whatever? Or do you mean that the proportion of
correct.
The parties doesn't match the
both.
proportion of political ideology in the public?
Yes, it's both, actually.
Both, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think both are issues. Both are definitely issues. So let's deal with them one at a time. One is, if you think there should be more than 435 elected members of the House of Representatives so that each represents fewer people, there is a mechanism to do that. In fact, it sort of lines up with what one of David Ferris's strategies was in his book. We interviewed him earlier in the week about how Democrats should play dirty, and one of the things they should do is both increase the number of states so that there are more senators and try to get more elected officials in the House of Representatives. The second issue is an issue that is just, it's inherent to the system that we have, which is if 5% of the population in all congressional elections votes for libertarians, but we end up with 0% libertarians in the House of Representatives, is that really fair? And the answer is it depends what you mean by fair. And under our current system, it is considered fair because it is, as you mentioned, a first past the post. You get one winner and that's it. Other countries have decided it differently, and I've spoken before about how I would be interested in exploring ways that we could do something like that in the U.S. Of course, the problem becomes that then when the white supremacists get 5% of the vote in a bunch of different races, not enough to win any race, now you got 5% white supremacists in the House of Representatives, and do you want that? But you're identifying two very real problems, for sure.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your insight on that, and it's something that I just don't hear spoken about. And there's all these great ideas that academia has to solve a lot of these problems, and it's surprising to me how it's like policy is this emergent phenomenon where these great ideas are filtered through the absolute wrong kind of people. But I kind of put that on. We're electing these career politicians instead of a bunch of representatives of ideas and ideology. I think people misconstrue what a politician. A politician is a representative of a community, not necessarily the greatest policymaker. No, they're going to filter an idea through a certain lens of ideology, whether people like that or not. That's just what we need. And in order to get that, you really need to work with good smart, intellectual people who can actually craft a policy that matches the ideology of the collective group.
I would love to see that, and I don't think we're going to see it anytime soon, unfortunately. I really appreciate the call. You're making really good points, and I hope to hear from you again. 617-830-4750 is the number. Let's try the 616 area code. Caller from 616, tell us who you are and go right ahead.
Hey, David, this is Derek from Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Great, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I hope you have your crystal ball available because I'm going to ask for some prognostication.
Okay.
So the hard right identifies with Trump very much these days. You know, they're MAGA hats and it's all Trump, Trump, Trump. But I see this as sort of like the same population of people sort of just morphing into a new identity. I mean, in the 90s, it was all about Pat Robertson, New World Order, Rapture, blah, blah, blah. Then in the 2000s, it was very Tea Party, Tea Party. Where do you think this group is going to go after Trump is relevant? I mean, how long do you think they're going to hold on to Trump as an identity?
I think that last part is less important. I think the first part is the really interesting one, which is what's the direction it will go next. And I think it is the total normalization of bold, proud ignorance as a legitimate political ideology. And that's what Trump, if Trump has legitimized anything more sort of acutely than a previous Republican, it is this sort of defense of, I don't know anything, I don't tell the truth, I don't behave, I can't be trusted, and that's okay because I've convinced people that I'm going to fix how they're being treated on trade or whatever else, right? And I think that is the most dangerous thing in the movement that Donald Trump has catalyzed, because it actually, so previously there were three like really distinct lines of republicanism, so to speak. You had the sort of Mitt Romney type, low tax, semi-moderate on social issues, although certainly not progressive, business conservatives. You had the very, very small government types, like the libertarian-minded, government is the problem types. And then he had the ideological religious conservatives. And they had overlaps, but there were also pretty significant points of disagreement. They still disagree, but the lines have been blurred significantly with these groups where they all have accepted the overarching philosophy of Trump to the extent that it exists, which is that it's great to not know anything. It's great to be clueless about politics. It's great to treat people poorly because I guess that identifies you as the common guy, but he's going to protect the status that I believe that I might lose if immigrants or Democrats or Obama are allowed to make decisions. So I think that is going to be the lasting effect of the Trump presidency.
Yeah, anti-intellectualism has been, has had a long thread in American history for sure.
Yep.
And it's definitely cyclical, but it is rearing its head right now in a way that is shocking and scary, especially given the access to information that we have at our fingertips with our phones.
No doubt. No doubt. Thank you so much for the call. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Take care.
617-830-4750 is the number. That is the one and only number for live calls, and we are taking calls. Let's go next to the 617 number. Maybe somebody from here in Boston. Caller from 617, tell us who you are and go right ahead.
Hey, David?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I'm from Boston. Actually, the one that took your tuna salad sandwich order yesterday.
That's right. Yes. Remind me your name again?
Yeah. My name's Oscar.
Oscar, right. Yeah, I met Oscar yesterday or earlier in the week, Pat. I went in and I had a completely not... Don't say where, by the way, Oscar. I don't want people showing up and stalking me.
I intentionally left that out.
I showed up and I had a completely non-vegan lunch, and Oscar was fine with it. And he said he's a fan of the show and he wants live calls to stay. So, yeah, what's going on, Oscar?
Hi, yeah. So I kind of had an interesting upbringing in the sense that my parents are pretty much traditionally liberal in the sense like the establishment type. They do share my ideas on progressive policies, but I've also had some friends who are very, very conservative, like libertarian type, pretty much for the most part. But my question is, whenever I talk to my parents about politics, they always seem to default to, the MSNBC, CNN talking points, where they'll just go to Trump, Russia, or you know, they'll keep saying these things about, and they share that same hatred of Trump that I do, of course. But I was just wondering what the best way you think to talk to those kind of establishment Democrat people who do share, you know, pretty much all of the same progressive policy ideas, but just are caught up in this kind of MSNBC establishment bubble.
Yeah. So here's the approach. Rather than telling them that they're focusing on stuff that doesn't matter, because Trump Russia is a real story, right? We cover the story, but it's not the only story that's going on. You want to use that and build on it, right? So you want to say, I completely agree with you on these issues. These are really important issues. And I also want to let you know that here's these 5 other things that you're not going to hear about on MSNBC and CNN that are just as important. And once Trump Russia is resolved, we're going to have to deal with, right? The fact that wages haven't gone up, but inequality has, or whatever issue, right? The environment, we're going backwards on the environment, whatever the case may be. Use the fact that they're already sort of on the right side to actually pull them into other issues they may not know about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I feel like these people, they get so caught up in that thing where they just don't want to, they don't have the time to kind of give their thought to those issues, even though they care about them. So.
Yeah, that's why you got to be ready with what are the issues. Like if you could only give them 1 or 2 new issues to think about, what are those 2 going to be? You have to be ready with that.
Yeah, right. I think I do that too, because I mentioned wealth inequality and the environment, like you said. Right. But at the same time, I feel like at the same time they keep watching MSNBC, and then they just divert their attention to Russia. I don't know. It's my family, so it's a little difficult, but it feels like we should never get anywhere. But yeah.
Well, it sounds like a whole situation over there, but it sounds like you're managing it pretty well. Oscar, thanks. Glad you got through. I know you've been trying for a while.
Yeah, thank you for taking it.
All right, take care. Great to hear from Oscar from Boston. Yeah, I met Oscar yesterday. Okay, that's going to do it for live calls. I wish I had more time. I just don't. I apologize to the dozen people that are holding, but we will take calls again, and it'll be great when we do. That I can promise you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
For today's classic interview, we go back to my interview with maybe one of the better-known medical ethicists in the United States today, Arthur Caplan. We spoke about the morality of genetic editing, and there's a couple different connections here. One is that in the last 2 years, the advancements of the CRISPR project have been significant, and the type of genetic editing that Arthur and I discussed during the interview is, in a sense, already a reality, but going to be mainstreamed as a possibility very, very soon. And it's also been 40 years since the beginning of in vitro fertilization, which is not genetic editing in any of the senses that I discussed with Art Caplan, but it is in a sense sort of the catalyst from which much of the current medical technology around genetic editing maybe came from in some sense. So I think what is interesting to think about is when you watch this interview, listen to this interview I did with Art back in January of 2016, do our views seem almost quaintly outdated in some way? In other words, have things advanced so much in terms of our perception of the issue of genetic editing that a conversation that's 2.5 years old seems almost outdated in terms of modern sensibilities? Back to January of 2016 when I interviewed medical ethicist Arthur Caplan. It's great to welcome back to the program Arthur Caplan, Director of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Langone Medical Center. We've been talking increasingly about genetic editing, and we covered the story of the 1-year-old girl with leukemia whose life was, at least for the time being, saved by the first procedure where genetically edited cells from a donor were implanted into her. And of course, as soon as we start talking about this, the emails pour in about the ethical and moral considerations of genetic editing. Let's start at sort of the broadest point. When you think about genetic editing, what are the moral and ethical concerns that you have, or at least that you most frequently hear cited?
Well, there are really 2 kinds of genetic editing. One is to change cells either modify cells and put them into the body, as it was done with the little girl, or to try and use viruses to insert genetic material into cells. Say someone with cystic fibrosis who has a genetic mistake, you're trying to get viruses to insert corrected material right into the lungs of the person. There's also genetic editing that takes place to eliminate diseases that are inherited. There you're trying to modify embryos, you're trying to change the DNA, correct errors there so that the disease is not passed on to a child or to grandchildren or to any descendants. The first kind of genetic editing is called somatic cells, body cells. They're not inherited, you're fixing something in a person. It's controversial because there's certainly safety considerations. People have died in the middle of these experiments. There's some controversy about whether or not it's right to try and repair diseases using genetic engineering when we don't have enough animal data. But because some of these diseases, animals don't get them. But overall, I think genetically editing body cells is fairly widely accepted. It makes sense in that it's the individual who has to make the choice about whether they want to take the risk. The benefits may or may not follow. People understand when they have terrible diseases that they may die in these experiments, but I think overall the verdict has been review them carefully, make sure the science is sound, make sure the informed consent is good, and let them proceed. Where you really get pushback is when people are trying to change embryos, change things that are passed on.
And that's I've received emails from people who seem to have completely opposite views on that. Some say if you're going to make changes that would lead to subsequent generations, in other words, the children of those whose embryos are changed, not requiring the same edit, in other words, eliminating something that would be inherited, that's good. And others say, no, that's not good because you're actually making changes to subsequent generations and they have sort of no choice over that. So it's interesting that I've received feedback from people with very, very divergent views on that particular issue.
Well, I think when we're talking about changing inherited DNA, modifying our descendants, there's really a couple of ethical concerns that the critics have. One is you just don't cross that line because the people affected can't consent. Your future daughter, your unborn grandchild, they can't say, I'll take the risk, try to fix my sickle cell disease, my hemophilia, my cystic fibrosis, whatever it is, I can't give you my permission. I have to say to that objection, I'm not impressed with that worry. I think parents make decisions for children all the time. We make them for newborns all the time. We do prenatal screening all the time.
Absolutely.
The fact is, people make choices for their descendants, and that's just a reality.
Absolutely. So now that we've said that you don't feel that that is a strong argument against that type of decision, what does strike you as a stronger argument there, or at least one we should pay more attention to?
I think when we're talking about genetic changes for heredity, looming over that area is the experience of Germany with eugenics, with trying to eliminate people who are disabled, weak, seen as burdens on society, seen as racially inferior. In our current world, we're hardly over racism, bigotry, and views that are anti-disability. So when people say, I want to get rid of bad things in future generations, part of the argument is, well, what is a bad thing? It's one thing to say, I don't want to pass on Tay-Sachs disease. Okay, that's going to kill the child, and it makes sense. I think it's hard to argue against that. It's another thing to say, I want to get rid of Asperger's, or I'm not sure I want to have a short child. Those sorts of things are differences. Are they diseases? Are they really problems that make people unhappy? So one key issue then becomes identify what it is you're talking about. How do you know when something really is a disease or just a difference? Clearly, some people, for example, in the deaf community would say, being deaf isn't a disease, it's a difference. We have our own language, we have our own colleges, we live happy lives, we contribute to society. You don't have to eliminate deafness. That's not something you have to genetically engineer out of the human species. Then the related issue is, what about the people who say, hey, great, as long as we can get rid of lethal or terrible diseases, why don't we improve ourselves? Why don't we make stronger, taller, faster, smarter kids? When you can do genetic changes that repair disease, you can also do genetic changes that enhance or improve, quote unquote, future generations. So I think the objections that we have to pay attention to are, how do we define what it is that we might try to fix without getting rid of all human diversity and just having, some perfect stereotype of the quote unquote healthy descendant? And then are we ready to go down a path that might open the door to really trying to improve our species?
How would you define, or how could we as a society figure out whether there's a sort of, I don't know, approved list of what we can, quote, fix or change? I mean, some people emailed me saying, listen, David, this is going to happen sooner or later. The medical community is going to improve on these techniques. This is going to be available. Does it not make more sense to regulate and sort of have some approved list of procedures that you can and can't do? But then the problem is, who is in charge of deciding, and what would be a sort of moral and ethical way to decide what is and is not allowed?
Well, I think those comments are right on point. If you say ban it, no changes, nothing allowed, that's hereditary,
right,
it's not going to happen. Plenty of other countries, China, Singapore, many places in the world, are going to be doing and using this technology to engineer diseases out of their children. It will take place. If the United States says, for example, no federal funds for embryo engineering, which right now is what we're saying, the major tool that the government has to impose regulations, to come up with that list, to designate a panel to do it, goes away. There's no federal funding. There's no lever to push on to make regulation possible. So what will happen here is a private market. The rich will drive what the technology does. Private companies will set up. They're not accountable to almost anyone in terms of the services they offer. By the way, that's what the infertility field looks like today.
Right.
A private market where single people, older people, you name it, anybody can use the services, and the clinics put in 5 embryos, 6 embryos, Octomom, etc. So we know what awaits us if we don't try to keep government funding present in order, in part, to allow us to shape or control the evolution of the technology. Look, I think it's silly to argue that we're not going to see efforts made to get rid of Tay-Sachs and breast cancer and prostate cancer and hemophilia and many, many other heritable diseases. No one is going to hold those people hostage for very long out of fears that we don't know where to draw the line. So we better be ready for a world in which people, at some point, if not tomorrow, in a few years, start to engineer embryos to get rid of awful, clearly terrible diseases.
Can you give us a sense, though, if it were up to you to sort of create a test or a question to decide, okay, eliminating hemophilia, making someone taller than they might be based on the 2 parents that they have, giving someone better than 20/20 vision. What sort of questions could we apply to determine whether a particular change should or should not be allowed, or is not ethical?
So at one end, we know that there are diseases that shorten lifespan and really contribute to clear dysfunction. And by the way, deafness and blindness are on that list for me. I understand why people say they can exist, either deaf or blind, and have great lives. But it's clear that not seeing and not hearing, these are dysfunctional states, and we could repair them.
Sure.
So better to be able to do them than not do them. It's not. Part of the issue then becomes, if we're going to go after these clearly dysfunctional, clearly life-shortening diseases, we better be careful to put in laws that say we're still going to support and respect people who don't choose to do this. Remember, it's not just a question of where do we draw the line. What if you say, I'm not going to fix cystic fibrosis in my kid? I'm going to have kids with diseases. Is the public going to turn around and say, hey, look, you could have fixed that. You chose not to. We're not paying for your health care. We're not paying for any disability programs. The blame's on you. You want to have kids that are sick, quote unquote. Not my problem. A big looming issue in a society that's becoming more and more individualistic. But to answer your question, I think each case has to be done on its merits. You're not going to find a single criteria that says, that's in or that's out. Somebody might say, freckles, let's get rid of them. And I think it's pretty clear we give an argument that says they don't affect lifespan, they don't affect dysfunction, they're just an appearance issue or a preference. We're not going to permit changes that allow us to eliminate freckling. I'm sure people are going to look at albinism. Albinos in our culture, a predominantly white society, not really discriminated against, not seen as the worst thing that can happen. In a lot of societies, Japan, Africa, albinism is a terrible disease. They stigmatize it. They want nothing to do with it. So I think it's going to have to be case by case, the burden on those to prove why it is that they want to have the disease eliminated. That's how I would handle it. I try to do it with a fair process, not so much a set of criteria that say, if you fulfill this, you get it. If you don't, you won't. Because I think it's going to change from place to place. And I think it's going to change, if you will, from economic situation to economic situation and so on.
Absolutely fascinating, super important questions that at some point will need to be answered. We've been speaking with Arthur Caplan, Director of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Langone Medical Center. Thanks so much for joining me again.
Thank you for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, let's get to some audience questions, starting with, hey, David, in the age of Trump, what kind of charities or causes do you think are the most important ones to support? I immediately go to the causes and charities that are going to defend the basic institutions that are under attack by the current president on the basis of his authoritarian tendencies. So immediately we've got to defend free speech organizations and organizations working on issues of speech. We have seen, Pat, significant and concerted attacks on press freedom and also on demonstrations. I think that very, very soon, with the Supreme Court pick that Donald Trump has made, you are going to see abortion under attack, not necessarily Roe v. Wade, but certainly at the state level, a variety of different proposals that may ultimately make it up to the Supreme Court to restrict access to abortion. I think that net neutrality, organizations working on net neutrality, need to be supported. Those are the ones that my mind goes to right away.
Yeah, there are so many, really. I think about child protection charities, right? Especially when we talk about families being split up. There's also the environment, right? So many charities there. And those are causes we should have been supporting all along, right? Groups like the Sierra Club and, the environment's been a big problem for a long time and getting worse and worse, but particularly so under the Trump administration and, deregulation going on, the regulatory capture within the EPA. So those are two that I thought of.
Yeah, climate change is a depressing one because I obviously completely agree with you, but at the same time, given the sort of bully pulpit and power that Trump has on that issue, are my donations to the Sierra Club going to do anything? I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad organization, and I'm not saying it's bad to be activating around this. I just am very deflated about, I think it's sort of like we've got an emergency and we've got to vote them out in 3.5 months. That's really the path forward. I just wish I felt like Sierra Club donations could really stop what's going on. I just don't know that they can.
Here's another one I was considering. What about contributing to like an LGBT cause? Republicans are typically not very good on those issues. After all, they opposed gay marriage for the longest time. But maybe we've moved past that. Maybe, there still are organizations like the Trevor Project out there that we should consider donating to. But is that particularly more important under the Trump administration than it would be under Hillary Clinton or a Democrat?
Yeah, I mean, it is. We've had, in 2015, we had the issue of state bans on same-sex marriage resolved, the Supreme Court saying you can't do that. But then the new fight along LGBT issues has been so-called religious freedom and finding new ways, basically, to suppress LGBT rights. So, yeah, there's no shortage, I think, is the point. But to get back to the question of most important, I go with organizations defending actual free speech on both the behalf of individuals and the press, as well as organizations that are going to work on internet freedom and net neutrality and campaign finance as well. Although that's not unique to the Trump Trump organization, the Trump administration. So that's an area where you should always be doing that.
It's funny you said the
Next
Trump
question.
organization.
Oh, yeah,
I was going to ask if you were going to contribute to the Trump Foundation too, which is a well-known charity.
Yes, if I want to support Trump commissioning portraits of himself to go up in his own golf clubs, that's the first donation that I'll make. Hey, David, with climate change set to transform the landscape of the globe, is there any place you want to visit before it's gone for good? Plus, when sea levels do rise, where do you think you'll move? A lot of the places I want to visit are coastal, right? Japan is an island nation. I really want to go to Japan. There's a lot of other places in Asia that are coastal places that I want to visit. But the second part, I mean, I want to go everywhere, and a lot of those places are on the coasts. I don't know which would be first. I want to go to Cuba soon before it becomes completely overrun by Starbucks and McDonald's or whatever else, and they have a lot of coastline. But I've actually been thinking more and more about when sea levels rise, where will I move to? Because as an elite coastal liberal, Pat, as you know me to be, the only places that I could see myself living in the United States are all coastal. If you take out the United States and say, where would I go if I went to Europe? It's basically all coastal cities. I guess Brussels isn't, but it's on a river, if I recall correctly. So I don't know where I'm going to go, and I'm already thinking about that. In Boston, I mean, it's a coastal city. New York City, it's a coastal city. I love Miami and San Francisco. Los Angeles would be after that I would consider living in. These are all places on the coast, so I don't really have any place. I guess I'd go to, what's a non-coastal place? Well, I could go back to Burlington, Vermont, even though that's on a lake, and maybe they would be screwed as well.
Of course, most major cities are on some body of water. Like I was thinking about Chicago or St. Louis, but I don't know. It's kind of a cop-out, right? They're not coastal, but St. Louis is on the Mississippi, and Chicago, you got Lake Michigan right there. So I don't know if it counts as coastal, but it's essentially the same thing.
It has a shoreline of sorts, although not an ocean one. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that this is the totally wrong point of view to take, because I think it gets people to not fix problems. But I do hope that I'm not waiting around for a solution to climate change. Like, I think we need to act now. But there are cities like Amsterdam that exist below sea level successfully. And my hope is that at least the protection of cities from sea level rise will have some advancement in terms of the technology that's available before it becomes a problem in cities like Boston and New York. That could be totally naive of me. I mean, maybe I'm waiting around for something that is just not going to happen.
But some of these islands, though, I mean, forget about it. Check out Key West while you can. Or, I think the Dead Sea is going to dry up by the year 2050. I'm also worried about the Glacier National Park area. I guess apparently it's like the one place you can go where in the middle of the summer and it's like 70, 80 degrees or whatever, you'll have these like mounds of snow, and it's apparently this beautiful view you can check out, but those glaciers are melting slowly but surely, and I want to check that out before they're all gone.
Yeah, there's a very famous large glacier area in my home country of Argentina, and I've never visited, but it's losing mass, and it's losing mass very quickly. It's still gigantic, right? It's still plenty to see, but that's a concern as well. I at some point, I may have to stop being an elite coastal progressive because there might not be anything left. I guess I could still be on the coast. It's just the coast might be 150 miles inland from where it is right now.
Would you change your politics too if you moved?
No, I would not. No, I would not. My politics I would probably become even more progressive because I would be angry that climate change made it so that we lost our coastal cities. Yeah. Last question for today. Hey, David, why do we call American billionaires billionaires and Russian billionaires oligarchs? Good question. Clever question. For me, the answer is one word: impunity. George Soros, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, in the context of the United States of America, rich people have a ton of power, but they can't act with impunity in the way that Russian oligarchs act with impunity within Russia. That's the big difference for me, right? And this is sort of you can start to slice it in different ways, but there is a security that the Russian oligarch has, at least in operating within their country, that somebody like Warren Buffett or Elon Musk or Bill Gates doesn't have within the United States. There's no question that we have basically two countries. We've got a country for rich people and a country for everybody else. Justice system, law enforcement's relationship, banking, all sorts of stuff, right? There's no question about it. But when I think about that word impunity, that for me is the difference between a Russian oligarch and an American billionaire. And we could go, into more detail and sort of think about other specific differences. But the ways in which even the Koch brothers or Soros use their power in the United States, there's still a little bit more of a framework and parameters around which they can use that power that I think when you talk about an oligarch isn't really there. That's sort of my thought. And I don't know if you have any strong feelings, Pat, about whether you think maybe American billionaires are oligarchs in the sort of Russian sense, but I keep going back to the idea of acting with impunity. And that's where the difference really is for me.
Yeah, maybe they ought to be considered oligarchs, but we just haven't assigned that name to them yet. I know there are many, studies out there, and people have been saying for a long time that the United States, because of our campaign finance system, operates more like an oligarchy than a democracy, which it's supposed to be. So I think it's a pretty fitting term. Maybe we should start embracing it.
There's another idea that the oligarch is so tied in and friendly with government that they're sort of like getting kickbacks with government, and there's not a clear line between whether an oligarch is involved in private business or in state business. You can make the case that that sort of exists in the United States, that the American billionaire with a super successful corporation, they can make deals with the government where there may not be literal kickbacks, but there's sort of kickbacks of convenience, if not of money. But I think that there is somewhat of a difference there as well, right? Like when you look in Russia at some of the banks and some of the energy companies, there's almost no division whatsoever between whether the head of that company is a private CEO or someone working for the Kremlin. And oftentimes it's kind of a combination of both. And that's a fair difference, I think, as well, although it's kind of a matter of degrees because it does exist within the United States also. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Sign up for membership at www.joinpacman.com or become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show to get instant access to the world famous bonus show. I'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.